They waited every day. They waited every single day for God to do something. Anna had been waiting 77 years. 77 years she had stood in the temple, praising God and waiting for God to do something. Now, we don't know Simeon's exact age, but you sort of get the sense that he was one that also wore gray hair as a crown of glory, that he was one who'd been waiting for quite a long time in the temple. These two faithful souls had heard promises made through the prophets about what God would do, that God would send a Messiah to them and bring about the redemption of Israel. They knew, they believed, they trusted, they hoped that God would come and act in a mighty way, but they hadn't yet seen it. For 77 years, night and day, Anna came to the temple and she waited. She waited for God to come. She fasted and she prayed. She trusted that God would somehow, someday come. And Simeon is described as a righteous and a devout man who was looking for the consolation of Israel. I particularly love that phrase. He was not looking for salvation and for the Messiah for himself. He was looking for the consolation, the peace of all of Israel to be realized and made known. He wanted God to be known in his country and among his people. I tried to imagine what it would have been like to be Anna and Simeon going day after day after day to the temple, waiting, going to worship, even when no results seemed to come, waiting, no one listening or not listening to the taunts and the scoffs of others who thought that maybe Anna and Simeon were a bit too religious. And they said, you shouldn't be waiting so much. You shouldn't be here so often. But they kept waiting. They didn't give in to the desires to sleep late or the desire to spend the day in selfish pleasures. They kept waiting, and they kept showing up every day, waiting and watching for God to do something. Now, I'm not sure that at any point in the entire history of the world, anyone has ever liked waiting. I don't think that anyone, even the cavemen, liked sitting around waiting for the fire to start or for their food to cook or for whatever it is that one has to wait for. None of us have ever been born with perfect self-control, and if you've ever been around a newborn, you know that. They like to cry, and they like to demand their way right now, and they don't have any sense of waiting or controlling their thoughts or emotions. Children begin to learn this skill, but it's a process. And again, you know that if you spend any time with a toddler, it's a process teaching them patience. And I'd love to say that adults, particularly pastors, have this skill mastered, but it's not true. I would like it to be true, but it's not. Waiting and patience, self-control, these things are always hard. And I think perhaps at no other time in the history of the world has there ever been a culture who is more in a hurry than ours is right now. For our centuries, we could only go as fast as a horse would gallop. But now, we can go so fast. And our computers work so fast. And our food can be cooked so quickly. And still, waiting has become even harder because we're moving faster. But I want to talk today not just about waiting for the traffic light to change or waiting in a long line at the grocery store. I want to talk about spiritual waiting, because spiritual waiting is something just a little bit different. It requires not just waiting for time to pass, but it also requires a continual trust that there is indeed something to wait for. We're not just waiting for the microwave to come to be done, or waiting for graduation to happen, or waiting for the sermon to be done. We're waiting for God to act and for God to do something. And there's something harder about that kind of waiting. I remembered Linus and the Great Pumpkin sitting in the pumpkin patch. He had to not just wait, but he had to fend off all of the others who said there was nothing to wait for. They said, "Come on, there's no reason to sit in this pumpkin patch and wait." So he not only had to wait for the Great Pumpkin to show, he had to also believe that there was something to wait for. And it struck me as I was writing this sermon that spiritual waiting is a bit like that, because we're waiting not just for God to do something, but we have to continually reshape our minds and our hearts and our practices to believe that, yes, indeed, there is something to wait for, because God will at some point act. We are not waiting in vain. Spiritual waiting is an exercise in trusting and loving God, and it is not easy. I wonder, could you be self-controlled and patient enough to wait for 77 years like Anna? Could you wait day after day like Simeon and believe that you would indeed get to see the Messiah? Today, on this Super Bowl Sunday, I thought it's a particularly good time to talk about patience and self-control. Because, not just because you're waiting for the game or you're waiting for whatever, but as you think about athletes, athletes have to be patient. They have to practice self-control. When a throw goes badly, or when someone breaks through the line of defense, when a game ends with an embarrassing score, you have to be patient. You have to be self-controlled. You have to not give up and keep working and keep trying. Keep at your goal no matter what. And while some athletes we admire more than others for their amount of patience and self-control, I think just to get there, just to be playing at a professional level, they had to have some amount of self-control and discipline and patience. And I thought about other places in the world outside of this church where we learn patience. Perhaps in martial arts, they're always teaching kids to be a little more patient, or teaching people who come through the program to be patient. You don't get a black belt on the first night that you come. It takes patience. It takes discipline. There's yoga, and we train our mind to be patient, right? You focus on your breathing, and you hold the stretch, and you learn patience and discipline. And then, of course, there's parenting classes and all sorts of other places where we learn to be patient. Now, these are all powerful examples of patience, and I think they make us better people. But I wondered, again, what is it about biblical patience that's different? What is it about Christian patience or Christian self-control, about the fruit of the Spirit that we're talking about today, that stands apart from all of those other places in the world where you could learn patience? And so I went and I looked and I made a sheet for all of you about places in the Bible that talk about patience and self-control. So these are on the back table if you desire them. Lessons and verses that teach us how important patience is. And then I thought about the Old Testament, and there are more stories than I could ever fit on a piece of paper about people who were patient in the Bible, about how Abraham had to wait for a son, or Joseph, who had to wait for years in prison, waiting to be released for something he didn't do. The Israelites, who had to wait to enter the promised land. Then the people in exile who were taken to Babylon had to wait to get to go back home. Elijah, the prophet, who had to wait out a drought and a famine and just receive food from a raven. The prophets who waited for a word from God so that they could tell the world about the long-awaited Messiah. So there's a lot of waiting in the Bible. But here's what I think is interesting. Our ancestors of the faith didn't just sit around and twiddle their thumbs and wait for God to come in an idle way. No, they waited, some with greater patience and some with less patience, but they waited by doing something. Anna and Simeon, they showed up at the temple. They kept going each and every day, even if it seemed like there was nothing to wait for. Moses kept going up the mountain and talking to God, even when the people didn't seem to listen. Daniel kept a strict diet, refusing to eat the royal food so that he could remember that he was waiting for something greater. We talked about Nehemiah in the fall and talked about how he fasted and he prayed and he waited before he went to the king to present his request. The people of the Bible did not sit idly by and just wait for God to do something. They continued to practice their faith. They continued to tell their stories. They continued to remember that somehow, some way, God would provide. They continued to participate in their faith as they waited. And then, when that moment came, when God finally acted, when they finally saw their hopes and dreams realized, they returned their thanks to God. As they crossed the Red Sea, Miriam sang and danced and celebrated that God was there and that God had done something great. David, as he entered the royal city into Jerusalem and brought with him the Ark of the Covenant that had been waiting to come, he danced. He stripped off his outer robe and he danced in his underwear because he was so excited that God had done something. Elijah used his time of waiting to develop a deeper prayer life. And Anna and Simeon, well, when they finally saw the baby Jesus and realized that this was through the Holy Spirit, that this was the Messiah, they rejoiced and they gave great thanks to God. They returned their thanks to God and used all of that waiting led to greater rejoicing and greater celebration. Now, I know that it is not easy to wait patiently. It's not easy to take a deep breath and say, even though I feel stressed and hurried, I can wait. I read a devotion during Advent this year in December, and it challenged me in my practice of waiting. The author challenged the readers to practice waiting by putting together a jigsaw puzzle or by praying in the midst of a traffic jam. And he was from Chicago, so it's not like he was used to little traffic jams. And he said, you should, in this Christmas season, intentionally get in the longest line and practice waiting as a way of learning patience. Waiting, said Richard Rohr, the author, is God's way of preparing us for something greater, of making our hearts ready to receive the gifts that God has for us. And I love this idea of practicing waiting, that I'm going to intentionally practice waiting, realizing that patience is not something that happens automatically. We grow patience in us. And as we do so, we refocus. We think about what is it that really matters? What is it that we're really waiting for? And as we find the answers to those questions, we're naturally drawn closer to God. Last year, I read a book, a sort of obscure book called A Different Kind of Cell. And the book was a nonfiction account of a man who was considered one of the most dangerous prisoners in all of the prison system. He was one who had committed several murders, including one of a prison guard. And so they kept him in the deepest, darkest, solitary confinement that they could find. But somehow, in the midst of his incarceration, he found a new faith. He discovered Jesus. He discovered a love of God. And he eventually became a monk. That's right. As he discovered his new faith, he was eventually given a special dispensation to be an auxiliary member of the local monastery. He still had to wait in the prison system for his death to come. His cell and his daily life still looked very much the same. He was still completely locked away deep in the prison system. But inside, his mind and his soul were different, completely different. He began to see his prison cell as a monastic cell, and he used his unending time in captivity to spend time in praying to God. Now, I tell you this story because I wonder about changing one's perspective that dramatically. I know that being stuck in a traffic jam, or waiting at the end of a ridiculously long line, or waiting for God to bring healing, waiting for God to bring hope, waiting for God to bring forgiveness or employment or whatever else it is that we've been waiting for, can feel like existing in a prison cell. Waiting often feels like torture. But I thought, what if it didn't? What if it wasn't torture? What if we intentionally put ourselves in times of waiting so that we could see what God was teaching us, so that we could see how God was reshaping us and making us new people? What if we believed that because of our waiting, we were becoming stronger? We were becoming more compassionate and more understanding. What if we intentionally practiced waiting and patience so that God could continue to grow spiritual fruit in us? 77 years. That's how long Anna and Simeon waited in the temple to see the Messiah. God blessed their waiting, and he helped give them the gift not only of seeing the Messiah, but of encouraging these two young parents who were given an enormous task from God. I think Joseph and Mary really needed Anna and Simeon's encouragement. And I think about how if they hadn't been waiting there in the temple for God to show up, they never would have seen it. They never would have seen the blessing for themselves, and they never would have been able to encourage these two young parents to say, God is with you, and God will strengthen you as you raise this young child. When they finally realized that the Messiah had come, they praised God even more. So let us do the same. Let us practice patiently waiting. And when we receive our blessings, let us turn them back to praise.